Neanderthal DNA in locations fundamental to our immune system.
And what first drew me into it was Denisova Cave in Siberia. I think everybody's heard of the Neanderthals, and these days I think everybody's heard of the Denisovans as well.
For more than 150 years, the scattered bones of Neanderthals have fueled debate. They were once dismissed as British cavemen, later reimagined as tragic survivors of the Ice Age. But the question never went away. Where did they really come from? For years, their story and real origin story remained incomplete and hidden. Now, with the power of ancient DNA, scientists are finally unlocking secrets buried in their cells. What's emerging is not the tale we expected. It is stranger, older, and far more unsettling than we ever imagined. The first discovery. The story of the Neanderthals began quietly in 1829 when Belgian scientist Philippe Charles Schmerling excavated caves near Engis in Belgium. Among the bones he uncovered was the skull of a child with features that did not fit modern humans. Its shape was unusual, with a low forehead and heavy brows. But in the early 19th century, the idea that there could have been other types of humans was unthinkable.
Inside the caves, teams of archaeologists search for remnants of Neanderthals' past.
Most scientists assumed it was simply an odd or diseased child. Schmerling's discovery was catalogued and set aside, its true importance ignored for decades. The breakthrough came in 1856, when workers digging limestone in Germany's Neander Valley pulled strange bones out of a cave. The skull was long and heavy, with a sloping forehead and massive brow ridges. The limb bones were thick and powerful. When scientists examined them, they could not agree on what they were. Some declared they belonged to a man crippled by rickets or arthritis. Others insisted they were from an extinct ape or bear. The possibility that these bones belonged to a different kind of human relative was too radical for many to accept. It was only as more skeletons surfaced across Europe in the late 1800s, in France, Croatia, and Spain, that the reality could no longer be denied. These were not isolated deformities or mistakes. They were evidence of a distinct human species that had once lived across the continent. In recognition of the Neander Valley find, scientists gave them a name, Homo neanderthalensis. But naming them did not end the debates. Even in the late 19th and early 20th century, scientists argued about what kind of people Neanderthals really were. Some reconstructions showed them as bent and ape-like, based on skeletons that suffered from arthritis. Museums and popular illustrations leaned into this image, portraying them as primitive brutes with clubs and snarling faces. These early portrayals stuck in the public imagination and cast a long shadow over how Neanderthals were viewed for decades. Yet behind the stereotypes was a deeper question that no fossil could answer. If Neanderthals had once roamed Europe, where had they come from in the first place? Some researchers thought they must have developed locally from earlier European ancestors. Others suspected their story began elsewhere. To break the deadlock, scientists would need a new kind of evidence, locked inside the fossils themselves. That evidence was DNA, and once it was recovered, it would transform everything we thought we knew about the Neanderthals. Reading the genetic code of the dead. In 1997, scientists tested a Neanderthal bone that had been sitting in a museum drawer for more than a century. The bone came from Feldhofer Cave in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, the very site where Neanderthals were first identified in 1856. For decades, the fossil had rested in the collection of the Rheinisches Landesmuseum in Bonn, carefully preserved but never imagined as anything more than a display piece. When a small fragment was handed over for testing, no one could be sure that anything useful remained inside.
One obvious follow-up question is, what is the impact of Neanderthal genetic contribution into people today?
Under the direction of Svante Pääbo at the University of Munich, researchers drilled into the dense part of the fossil and collected a fine powder. What they pulled from it left the scientific world stunned. Against all odds, they recovered strands of mitochondrial DNA, genetic material that passes from mother to child. They were immediately faced with challenges. The fragments were fragile, often broken into pieces only a few dozen letters long. They were mixed with DNA from soil microbes and with modern contamination from people who had handled the fossil over the years. The success proved the task was possible, but it also showed just how difficult the road ahead would be. The real push began that same year when the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology was established in Leipzig. Haebo moved there and built a team devoted entirely to ancient DNA. To build a complete genome, they needed Neanderthal bones that still held enough DNA to work with. Ordinary fossils often carried nothing but dust, so the team targeted remains that had been preserved in cold and stable conditions. One of the most important sources was Vindija Cave in Croatia, where Neanderthal bones discovered in the 1970s had been stored in the Croatian Natural History Museum. The cool cave environment had protected them better than most European sites. Another set of samples came from Siberia, where permafrost kept remains locked in frozen soil for tens of thousands of years. These bones belonged to Neanderthals, who had lived in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and they were chosen because their preservation gave the best chance of finding intact genetic material. Each fossil was drilled with sterile tools so the researchers could reach the dense inner bone that had been least exposed to contamination. The powder from these drillings was then dissolved in chemical solutions to release whatever fragments of DNA still clung inside. Every step of the process had to be protected from contamination. The laboratories were sealed and sterilized, and the scientists worked in full protective suits. The DNA fragments themselves were short and badly damaged, so researchers looked for a telltale chemical pattern at their ends that proved they were truly ancient.
Neanderthal DNA in locations fundamental to our immune system.
Enzymes were used to clean up the fragments. Artificial tags were added so they could be tracked. And then millions of copies were made until the sequences were readable by modern machines. To keep the results grounded in real time, specialists at the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit dated the bones and surrounding material, making sure the genetic data matched the archaeological record. By 2010, after years of careful work, Haebo's team at the Max Planck Institute published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome. This was the first time scientists had managed to read the full genetic code of a long-extinct human relative. The result confirmed what the earlier mitochondrial tests had already suggested. Neanderthals were not a diseased form of modern humans. They were a separate species that had split from our ancestors about 500,000 to 600,000 years ago. But the draft genome also raised new questions. Some parts of the DNA did not fit neatly with the idea of a clean separation between Neanderthals and modern humans. The data hinted at a more complicated history, but researchers were not yet ready to say exactly what it meant. What mattered most at this stage was that the genome had finally been captured, and it gave scientists a powerful new tool to test old theories. The next step was to compare Neanderthal DNA from different regions. Only then did scientists begin to see the full picture, and the findings pushed the story far beyond Europe.
The Neanderthal face is very different to the shape of a modern face, and many arguments about how that face evolved and why it evolved.
The shocking Asian connection. For a while, the Neanderthal draft genome from Vindija Cave was treated as the standard model of what a Neanderthal genome looked like. But that assumption quickly began to unravel when another genome was recovered from a small toe bone found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. This specimen became known as the Altai Neanderthal, and when researchers in Leipzig compared it with the Croatian genome, they were stunned by the differences. The two Neanderthals lived tens of thousands of years apart and thousands of miles away from one another. Yet the genetic gap between them was far larger than expected. This was not the pattern of a single uniform species moving slowly across Europe. Instead, it showed that Neanderthals were divided into separate populations that had been isolated from each other for long periods of time. The Altai genome revealed that the eastern branch of Neanderthals had been living in Siberia for hundreds of thousands of years, evolving on a different track from their western relatives. This finding was a shock because for more than a century, Neanderthals had been treated as a European story. Their bones had been found in Germany, France, Spain, and Croatia. So the assumption was that Europe was their true home. The genome evidence broke that picture apart. Neanderthals were not confined to Europe at all. They were spread across a vast territory that stretched thousands of miles into Asia. The Altai genome also carried other surprises. Its DNA showed signs of deep genetic splits that hinted at ancient contacts with other hominin populations in Asia. While the exact details were not yet clear, the evidence proved that Neanderthal history could not be explained by European fossils alone. To fully understand them, scientists would need to look eastward as well as westward. Archaeological discoveries added to this picture. In parts of China, stone tools had been found that closely resembled those used by Neanderthals in Europe. It was not clear whether these tools had been made by Neanderthal populations themselves or by other groups who had borrowed their techniques, but their presence showed that ideas and possibly people were moving across huge distances. And in the same Siberian cave where the Altai Neanderthal was discovered, another fragment would lead to an even bigger shock. Encounters with the Denisovans. In 2008, deep inside Denisova Cave in Siberia, scientists unearthed what seemed like an insignificant fossil. Russian archaeologists excavating the cave uncovered a fragment of a finger bone from a young girl. The piece was so small that at first it seemed unimportant. It was stored away and later passed to the team in Leipzig for genetic testing. When Svante Pääbo's group extracted DNA from it, the results shocked everyone. The bone did not match Neanderthals, and it did not match modern humans. It belonged to an entirely different population of ancient humans. These people were given a new name taken directly from the cave itself. They became known as the Denisovans. This finding instantly changed the picture of human evolution.
Human, and they were in every sense human because anatomically modern humans interbred with Neanderthals. You can't interbreed with another species.
Until then, scientists thought the Ice Age world had been populated only by Neanderthals and early modern humans. The Denisovans showed that there had been at least 3 separate groups alive at the same time. Even more surprising, the DNA revealed that Neanderthals and Denisovans were not strangers to one another. They had lived side by side in parts of Asia, and their genes showed that they had interbred more than once. One of the clearest proofs came in 2018, when researchers analyzed the remains of a teenage girl found in the same cave. Her DNA showed she had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. She was not the product of distant ancestry or faint traces. She was a direct child of 2 different groups. This single discovery proved beyond doubt that Neanderthals and Denisovans did not just meet. They formed families together. Other comparisons showed that mixing happened in more than one place and at different times. Some Neanderthal populations carried Denisovan DNA, which meant these encounters were not rare events. The Denisovans themselves turned out to have been more widespread than first imagined. Their DNA left traces across Asia and even beyond. Modern people in Tibet, Papua New Guinea, and Australia still carry Denisovan genes today. In Tibet, one Denisovan genetic variant helps people live at high altitude by improving the way their bodies use oxygen. That meant the Denisovans had not only lived in Asia, but had passed down traits that continue to shape human biology in the present. The discovery of the Denisovans destroyed the old simple picture of human history. Evolution was no longer a straight line from archaic ancestors to us. It was a braided web of populations that split, rejoined, and influenced one another again and again. If Neanderthals had such deep ties with their cousins in Asia and yet remained distinct, the question of their own origin could no longer be ignored. Where had they really come from? And why did the DNA refuse to point to a single homeland? The answer is even more unsettling than the discovery of the Denisovans themselves. The real origin revealed. The draft Neanderthal genome, published in 2010, and the high-quality Altai genome, completed in 2014, gave scientists their first chance to map ancestry in detail. By comparing these genomes to other ancient and modern DNA, Svante Pääbo's team and their collaborators showed that Neanderthals descended from Homo heidelbergensis. This species had lived about 600,000 years ago and is often seen as a bridge between earlier humans and later ones. They had larger brains and more advanced tools than their ancestors, and stood close in form to both Neanderthals and us. Fossils of Homo heidelbergensis had been found in Africa, such as in Ethiopia, and in Europe, such as at Cima de los Huesos in Spain.
Moreover, almost all these genetic variants we see outside Africa have closely related DNA sequences that you find inside Africa.
Because these fossils were spread across continents, the message was clear. Neanderthals did not spring from one birthplace. They grew out of a population that was already scattered across Africa and Eurasia. When scientists examined the Altai genome more closely, the surprise only deepened. The DNA carried signals pointing in several directions. Some sequences tied Neanderthals to populations in Europe, others tied them to groups in Asia, and still others hinted at contributions from even older lineages. One of those lineages was Homo erectus, a species that had lived in Asia for more than 1 million years. Homo erectus was one of the earliest human forms to walk fully upright and to leave Africa, and their fossils had been found from Indonesia to China. If Neanderthals carried traces of Homo erectus, it meant their ancestors had mixed with older populations already living in Asia long before the classic Neanderthal form appeared. To make the picture even more complex, the genomes also revealed that Neanderthals were linked to modern humans, our own species known scientifically as Homo sapiens, far earlier than expected. Modern humans are defined by lighter skeletons, higher foreheads, smaller faces, and a capacity for symbolic thought and language that shaped culture. The genetic record showed that Neanderthals and early modern humans had begun interbreeding over 200,000 years ago, much earlier than scientists once thought. This revelation shocked researchers because it overturned the entire framework of human evolution. It showed that Neanderthals were not an isolated branch, but one strand in a web of human groups who were constantly meeting, mixing, and reshaping one another.
Certain populations in the world today still have 3 to 5% of Neanderthal DNA.
The next challenge for scientists was to understand how that web actually functioned. How did these groups survive in such hostile conditions, and how did their movements across continents create the constant exchanges that shaped their DNA? Climate, waves, and crossroads. Neanderthal history did not play out in a quiet or stable world. Their lives were shaped by the brutal cycles of the ice ages, when massive glaciers advanced and retreated across Europe again and again. During the coldest phases, huge sheets of ice covered much of the continent, forcing both animals and humans to abandon entire regions. During this period, they survived in southern refuges such as Spain, Italy, and the Balkans. When the glaciers melted, they moved north into lands that had been uninhabitable only centuries earlier. Archaeological evidence shows Neanderthals returned to the same refuges repeatedly, suggesting they had patterns of movement that lasted thousands of years. DNA evidence confirmed that these movements were not limited to Europe. Neanderthals were connected to Africa as well. Their ancestor, Homo heidelbergensis, had lived in both Africa and Eurasia, and waves of populations moving out of Africa contributed to the Neanderthal story.
Here were the first flower people, a discovery wholly unprecedented in archaeology.
Some groups returned into Africa carrying Neanderthal-linked genes, while others pushed deeper into Eurasia. These back-and-forth movements explain why the Neanderthal genome carries signals that stretch across continents. One of the most important crossroads in this process was the Caucasus Mountains, which sat at the natural boundary between Europe and Asia. Archaeological sites in this region, such as Mezmaiskaya Cave, produced Neanderthal fossils that showed clear genetic connections between Eastern and Western populations. This proved the Caucasus was not an obstacle, but a bridge that allowed ideas, tools, and genes to flow in both directions. There were other gateways as well: North Africa and the Levant. The region that includes modern Israel, Jordan, and Syria acted as vital corridors linking Africa and Eurasia. During colder phases of the Ice Age, deserts and harsh conditions closed these routes, but when the climate warmed, they reopened. Fossils and stone tools from sites in the Levant, such as Tabun Cave and Kafza, showed that both Neanderthals and early modern humans had passed through these areas at different times.
Cave is hugely iconic in the history of Neanderthal studies and played a really pivotal role in us.
Together, the Caucasus, North Africa, and the Levant formed the main crossroads of the Neanderthal world. Every time these routes became accessible, new waves of people moved through them, carrying their genes and technologies with them. This constant movement created diversity and strength, but it also left a haunting question. If they were so adaptable, so deeply tied to 3 continents, and so connected to other human groups, why did Neanderthals eventually vanish while modern humans survived? What happened to the Neanderthals? About 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthal story came to an end.
Even with respect to the Neanderthals, we're here and they're not because we were better than they were.
Scientists once imagined that they were wiped out suddenly, but the evidence paints a different picture. The end was slow and relentless, a decline that unfolded over thousands of years. Fossil and archaeological records show that Neanderthal populations had already begun shrinking long before their final disappearance. In many regions, once thriving sites became empty. Genetic studies confirmed this decline. When researchers sequenced Neanderthal DNA, they saw clear signs of reduced diversity. Their genomes carried markers of inbreeding, meaning groups were so small and isolated that close relatives were often forced to mate. Some estimates suggest that all the surviving Neanderthals of Europe and Western Asia may have numbered only a few thousand individuals scattered across vast territories. Such fragile populations could not withstand crisis after crisis. At the same time, modern humans were spreading into Europe and Western Asia. Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens arrived from Africa with larger groups, broader social networks, and more flexible survival strategies. Archaeological evidence suggests they carried lighter, more efficient tools, wider food options, and stronger systems of cooperation. Modern humans built connections across long distances, exchanging ideas and resources between groups. In a world where resources were scarce and winters were brutal, this gave them an edge. Competition was unavoidable, and Neanderthals were often the ones pushed aside. Climate shifts made their struggle even harder.
So there are times when it's warm, it's nearly as warm as today and the sea is quite close.
The late Ice Age was a time of violent change. In some centuries, Europe froze under sheets of ice, and in others, the environment warmed suddenly. Food sources vanished, returned, and vanished again. For populations already small and scattered, these shocks could be devastating. In some regions, Neanderthals clung on for centuries alongside modern humans, as sites in France and Spain reveal, but eventually their record ended. Other pressures may have contributed as well. Some scientists argue that pathogens carried by incoming Homo sapiens could have struck Neanderthal groups who lacked immunity, just as new diseases devastated indigenous populations in the Americas thousands of years later. Though debated, the idea highlights how vulnerable small, stressed populations would have been to outside contact. When the last Neanderthal died, Their culture, voices, and lives disappeared forever.
The skull itself was very heavily crushed, so actually the entire skull was crushed flat and was probably 2-3 centimeters thick.
What remained were fragments of their DNA, still carried inside modern humans today. The Neanderthals themselves were gone, but their story did not end there. A different struggle began over how they would be remembered. Scientists, artists, and popular culture created an image of Neanderthals that shaped how generations thought of them. Yet this image was often a myth, one that painted them as less than what they truly were. Myths, misrepresentations, and the truth. For much of the 20th century, Neanderthals carried a reputation that was more myth than fact. In textbooks, museum displays, and popular culture, they were shown as bent, slow, and half-animal. One of the biggest sources of this myth was a single skeleton excavated at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France in 1908. The bones belonged to an older male Neanderthal who suffered from severe arthritis.
I had the pieces and I could start to do the restoration, which is a big jigsaw.
His spine was curved and his joints were damaged. When French paleontologist Marcelin Boule studied the skeleton, he assumed these features were typical of the entire species. In 1911, he published his findings, showing Neanderthals as hunched, awkward, and brutish. His study spread quickly, shaping how the public and even scientists thought about them for decades. The myth of the stooped caveman lasted for generations, but it was built on errors and prejudice. In the early 1900s, science was heavily influenced by social and cultural biases. European researchers were invested in ranking human groups in a hierarchy, with modern Europeans placed firmly at the top. Presenting Neanderthals as degenerate and subhuman fit neatly into this worldview. It allowed scientists to draw a sharp line between advanced modern humans and supposedly inferior others. Museum exhibits and popular illustrations did not just reflect scientific ideas. They reinforced social stereotypes about progress, race, and superiority. This prejudice made it easier for the brute image to spread, and harder for new evidence to overturn it. Even when later studies showed Neanderthals walked upright and had large brains comparable to ours, the old image lingered in public imagination. It took decades of careful excavation, new reconstructions, and eventually genetic breakthroughs to correct the record. Archaeology also revealed another side to their lives that clashed with the brute stereotype. Excavations showed that Neanderthals buried their dead, crafted tools with precision, and may even have cared for the sick and injured. In Shanidar Cave in Iraq, the remains of an injured man who had lived for years despite serious disabilities suggested that Neanderthal groups looked after their own. These discoveries forced scientists to rethink what kind of people Neanderthals really were. Step by step, the errors were stripped away. Neanderthals were revealed as strong and capable people, adapted to some of the harshest climates on Earth. Correcting the myth is more than a matter of scientific accuracy. It means confronting the prejudices of the past and restoring dignity to a human species that had been misunderstood for more than a century. What do you think about the Neanderthals? Comment down below.